أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله اللهم صل على محمد. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله أشهد أن عليا ولي الله أشهد أن عليا حجة الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله اللهم صل على
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله أشهد أن عليا ولي الله وأنه حجة الله صلوات الله عليه حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله الله أكبر بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إنا أنزلناه في ليلة القدر وما أدراك ما ليلة القدر ليلة القدر خير من 1000 شهر تنزل الملائكة والروح فيها بإذن ربهم من كل أمر سلام هي حتى مطلع الفجر الله أكبر سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر أستغفر الله الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين ولا الضالين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد كذلك الله ربي الله أكبر اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. الله أكبر.
سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده.
سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر.
سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده.
الله أكبر. أستغفر الله. الله أكبر.
سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده.
الله أكبر. الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد. الله أكبر.
سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده.
سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر.
سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده.
الله أكبر. أستغفر الله. الله أكبر.
سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده.
الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد. الله أكبر.
سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. سبحان الله.
سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر.
سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده.
الله أكبر. أستغفر الله. الله أكبر.
سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
الله أكبر. الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم إنه ليس لي علم بموضع رزقي، وإنما أطلبه بخطرات تخطر على قلبي، فأجول في طلبه البلدان، فأنا فيما أنا طالب كالحيران، لا أدري أفي سهل هو أم في جبل، أم في أرض أم في سماء، أم في بر أم في بحر، وعلى يدي من ومن قبل من. وقد علمت أن علمه عندك وأسبابه بيدك، وأنت الذي تقسمه بلطفك وتسببه برحمتك. اللهم فصل على محمد وآله، واجعل يا رب رزقك لي واسعا، ومطلبه سهلا ومأخذه قريبا، ولا تعنني بطلب ما لم تقدر لي فيه رزقا، فإنك غني عن عذابي، وأنا فقير إلى رحمتك. فصل على محمد وآله، وجد على عبدك بفضلك، إنك ذو فضل عظيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد جل فرجه. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم إني أسألك برحمتك التي وسعت كل شيء، وبقوتك التي قهرت بها كل شيء، وخضع لها كل شيء، وذل لها كل شيء، وبجبروتك التي غلبت بها كل شيء، وبعزتك التي لا يقوم لها شيء، وبعظمتك التي ملأت كل شيء، وبسلطانك الذي على كل شيء، وبوجهك الباقي بعد فناء كل شيء، وبأسمائك التي ملأت أركان كل شيء، وبعلمك الذي أحاط بكل شيء، وبنور وجهك الذي أضاء له كل شيء. يا نور يا قدوس، يا نور يا قدوس، يا نور يا قدوس، يا أول الأولين ويا آخر الآخرين. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تهتك العصام، اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تنزل النقام، اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تغير النعم، اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تحبس الدعاء، اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تنزل البلاء. اللهم اغفر لي كل ذنب أذنبته، وكل خطيئة أخطأتها. اللهم إني أتقرب إليك بذكرك، وأستشفع بك إلى نفسك، وأسألك بجودك أن تدنيني من قربك، وأن توزعني شكرك، وأن تلهمني ذكرك. اللهم إني أسألك سؤال خاضع متذلل خاشع، أن تسامحني وترحمني، وتجعلني بقسمك راضيا قانعا، وفي جميع الأحوال متواضعا. اللهم وأسألك سؤال من اشتدت فاقته، وأنزل بك عند الشدائد حاجته، وعظم فيما عندك رغبته. اللهم عظم سلطانك وعلى مكانك وخفي مكرك وظهر أمرك وغلب قهرك وجرت قدرتك ولا يمكن الفرار من حكومتك. اللهم لا أجد لذنوبي غافرا ولا لقبائحي ساترا ولا لشيء من عملي القبيح بالحسن مبدلا غيرك. لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك وبحمدك. ظلمت نفسي ظلمت نفسي ظلمت نفسي وتجرأت بجهلي وسكنت إلى قديم ذكرك لي ومنك علي. اللهم مولاي كم من قبيح سترته وكم من فادح من البلاء أقلته وكم من عثار وقيته وكم من مكروه دفعته وكم من ثناء جميل لست أهلا له نشرته. اللهم عظم بلائي وأفرط بي سوء حالي وقصرت بي أعمالي وقعدت بي أغلالي وحبسني عن نفعي بعد أملي وخدعتني الدنيا بغرورها ونفسي بجنايتها ومطالي يا سيدي. فأسألك بعزتك ألا يحجب عنك دعائي سوء عملي وفعالي ولا تفضحني بخفي ما اطلعت عليه من سري ولا تعاجلني بالعقوبة على ما عملته في خلواتي من سوء فعلي وإساءتي ودوام تفريطي وجهالتي وكثرة شهواتي وغفلتي. وكن اللهم بعزتك في كل الأحوال رؤوفا وعلي في جميع الأمور عطوفا. إلهي وربي من لي غيرك. أسأله كشف ضري والنظر في أمري. إلهي ومولاي أجريت علي حكما اتبعت فيه هوى نفسي ولم أحترس فيه من تزيين عدوي فغرني بما أهوى وأسعده على ذلك القضاء فتجاوزت بما جرى علي من ذلك بعد حدودك وخالفت بعض أوامرك فلك الحجة علي في جميع ذلك ولا حجة لي فيما جرى علي فيه قضاؤك وألزمني حكمك وبلاؤك. وقد أتيتك يا إلهي بعد تقصيري وإسرافي على نفسي معتذرا نادما منكسرا مستقيلا مستغفرا منيبا مقرا مذعنا معترفا لا أجد مفرا مما كان مني ولا مفزعا أتوجه إليه في أمري غير قبولك عذري وإدخالك إياي في سعة من رحمتك. اللهم فاقبل عذري وارحم شدة ضري وفكني من شد وثاقي. يا رب ارحم ضعف بدني يا رب ارحم ضعف بدني يا رب ارحم ضعف بدني ورقة جلدي ودقة عظمي. يا من بدأ خلقي وذكري وتربيتي وبري وتغذيتي هبني لابتداء كرمك وسالف برك بي. يا إلهي وسيدي وربي أتراك معذبي بنارك بعد توحيدك
وبعد من طوى عليه قلبي من معرفتك، ولهج به لساني من ذكرك، واعتقده ضميري من حبك، وبعد صدق اعترافي ودعائي خاضعا لربوبيتك. هيهات أنت أكرم من أن تضيع من ربيته، أو تبعد من أدنيته، أو تشرد من آويته، أو تسلم إلى البلاء من كفيته ورحمته. وليت شعري يا سيدي وإلهي ومولاي، أتسلط النار على وجوه خرت لعظمتك ساجدة، وعلى ألسن نطقت بتوحيدك صادقة، وبشكرك مادحة، وعلى قلوب اعترفت بإلهيتك محققة، وعلى ضمائر حوت من العلم بك حتى صارت خاشعة، وعلى جوارح سعت إلى أوطان تعبدك طائعة، وأشارت باستغفارك مذعنة. ما هكذا الظن بك، ولا أخبرنا بفضلك عنك. يا كريم يا رب، يا كريم يا رب، يا كريم يا رب. وأنت تعلم ضعفي عن قليل من بلاء الدنيا وعقوباتها، وما يجري فيها من المكاره على أهلها، على أن ذلك بلاء ومكروه، قليل مكثوه، يسير بقاؤه، قصير مدته. فكيف احتمالي لبلاء الآخرة وجليل وقوع المكاره فيها، وهو بلاء تطول مدته ويدوم مقامه، ولا يخفف عن أهله، لأنه لا يكون إلا عن غضبك وانتقامك وسخطك، وهذا ما لا تقوم له السماوات والأرض. يا سيدي، فكيف بي وأنا عبدك الضعيف الذليل الحقير المسكين المستكين. يا إلهي وربي وسيدي ومولاي، لأي الأمور إليك أشكو، ولما منها أضج وأبكي، لأليم العذاب وشدته، أم لطول البلاء ومدته؟ فلئن صيرتني للعقوبات مع أعدائك، وجمعت بيني وبين أهل بلائك، وفرقت بيني وبين أحبائك وأوليائك، فهبني يا إلهي وسيدي ومولاي وربي. صبرت على عذابك، فكيف أصبر على فراقك؟ وهبني صبرت على حر نارك، فكيف أصبر عن النظر إلى كرامتك؟ أم كيف أسكن في النار ورجائي عفوك؟ فبعزتك يا سيدي ومولاي أقسم صادقا، لئن تركتني ناطقا لأذجن إليك بين أهلها ضجيج الآمنين، ولأصرخن إليك صراخ المستصرخين، ولأبكين عليك بكاء الفاقدين، ولأنادينك أين كنت يا ولي المؤمنين، يا غاية آمال العارفين، يا غياث المستغيثين، يا غياث المستغيثين،
يا غياث المستغيثين، يا حبيب قلوب الصادقين، ويا إله العالمين. أفتراك سبحانك يا إلهي وبحمدك تسمع فيها صوت عبد مسلم سجن فيها بمخالفته وذاق طعم عذابها بمعصيته وحبس بين أطباقها بجرمه وجريرته، وهو يضج إليك ضجيج مؤمل لرحمتك ويناديك بلسان أهل توحيدك ويتوسل إليك بربوبيتك. يا مولاي، فكيف يبقى في العذاب وهو يرجو ما سلف من حلمك؟ أم كيف تؤلمه النار وهو يامل فضلك ورحمتك؟ أم كيف يحرقه لهيبها وأنت تسمع صوته وترى مكانه؟ أم كيف يشتمل عليه زفيرها وأنت تعلم ضعفه؟ أم كيف يتقلقل بين أطباقها وأنت تعلم صدقه؟ أم كيف تزجره زبانيتها وهو يناديك يا ربه؟ أم كيف يرجو فضلك في عتقه منها فتتركه فيها؟ هيهات، ما ذلك الظن بك ولا المعروف من فضلك ولا مشبه لما عملت به الموحدين من برك وإحسانك. فباليقين أقطع لولا ما حكمت به من تعذيب جاحديك وقضيت به من إخلاد معانديك لجعلت النار كلها بردا وسلاما وما كان لأحد فيها مقرا ولا مقاما. لكنك تقدست أسماؤك أقسمت أن تملأها من الكافرين من الجنة والناس أجمعين وأن تخلد فيها المعاندين وأنت جل ثناؤك قلت مبتدئا وتطولت بالإنعام متكرما. أفمن كان مؤمنا كمن كان فاسقا لا يستوون. إلهي وسيدي، فأسألك بالقدرة التي قدرتها وبالقضية التي حتمتها وحكمتها وغلبت من عليه أجريتها، أن تهب لي في هذه الليلة وفي هذه الساعة كل جرم أجرمت وكل ذنب أذنبت وكل قبيح أسررت وكل جهل عاملت كتمته أو أعلنت أخفيته أو أظهرت وكل سيئة أمرت بإثباتها الكرام الكاتبين الذين وكلتهم بحفظ ما يكون مني وجعلتهم شهودا علي مع جوارحي، وكنت أنت الرقيب علي من ورائهم والشاهد لما خفي عنهم، وبرحمتك أخفيت وبفضلك سترت، وأن توفر حظي من كل خير تنزل أو إحسان تفضل أو بر تنشر أو رزق تبسط أو ذنب تغفر أو خطأ تستر. يا ربي يا ربي يا رب يا ربي يا ربي يا رب يا ربي يا ربي يا رب يا إلهي وسيدي ومولاي ومالك رقي، يا من بيده ناصيتي، يا عليما بضري ومسكنتي، يا خبيرا بفقري وفاقتي، يا ربي يا ربي يا رب يا ربي يا ربي يا رب يا ربي يا ربي يا رب. أسألك بحقك وقدسك وأعظم صفاتك وأسمائك أن تجعل أوقاتي في الليل والنهار بذكرك معمورا، وبخدمتك موصولا، وأعمالي عندك مقبولا، حتى تكون أعمالي وأورادي كلها وردا واحدا، وحالي في خدمتك سرمدا. يا سيدي، يا من عليه معولي، يا من إليه شكوت أحوالي، يا ربي يا ربي يا رب، يا ربي يا ربي يا رب، يا ربي يا ربي يا رب. قو على خدمتك جوارحي، واشتد على العزيمة جوانحي، وهب لي الجد في خشيتك والدوام في اتصالي بخدمتك، حتى أصرح إليك في ميادين السابقين، ولأسرع إليك في المبادرين، وأشتاق إلى قربك في المشتاقين، وأدنو منك دنو المخلصين، وأخافك مخافة الموقنين، وأجتمع في جوارك مع المؤمنين. اللهم من أرادني بسوء فأرد، ومن كادني فكد، واجعلني من أحسن عبيدك نصيبا عندك، وأقربهم منزلة منك، وأخصهم زلفة لديك، فإنه لا ينال ذلك إلا بفضلك، وجد لي بجودك، واعطف علي بمجدك، واحفظني برحمتك، واجعل لساني بذكرك لهجا، وقلبي بحبك متيما، ومن علي بحسن إجابتك، وأقلني عثرتي واغفر زلتي، فإنك قضيت على عبادك بعبادتك، وأمرتهم بدعائك، وضمنت لهم الإجابة. فإليك يا ربي نصبت وجهي، وإليك يا ربي مددت يدي، فبعزتك استجب لي دعائي، وبلغني مناي، ولا تقطع من فضلك رجائي، واكفني شر الجن والإنس من أعدائي. يا سريع رضا، يا سريع رضا، يا سريع رضا، اغفر لمن لا يملك إلا الدعاء، فإنك فعال لما تشاء. يا من اسمه دواء، وذكره شفاء، وطاعته غنى، ارحم من رأس ماله الرجاء، وسلاحه البكاء. يا سابغ النعام، يا دافع النقام، يا نور المستوحشين في الظلام، يا عالما لا يعلم، صل على محمد وآل محمد، وافعل بي ما أنت أهله. وصلى الله على رسوله والآئمة الميامين من آله، وسلم تسليما كثيرا. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. Okay, so we are done with our introduction, which had to do with us figuring out, inshallah, that we are after, as a jurist, as a mujtahid, we are after real rules based on real good and bad, okay? And we can sometimes get it right, we can sometimes get it wrong. If we get it right, alhamdulillah, we have secured the good and bad that rule has for us in this life. And inshallah, also secured akhirah. If we got the rule wrong, we missed out on the good or bad that rule had for us here. But it's fine, because in one way or another, there were different opinions. Allah makes it up to the person who followed that which Allah had made hujjah on them and binding on them and told them to follow the lead of that proof or evidence they had for whatever rule they had come to. So having said all of that, now that we know what we're after such rules. Where do we get them from? Well, we all know as Shia the four sources that we go to. The first one, of course, being the Quran. And then you have the Sunnah or the Ahadith, and then you have Ijma' and Aql, which we'll get to inshallah. Quran is where we're going to begin. And of course, in these conventional books that you have for Usul al-Fiqh, they will give you the definition of Quran, what they mean by it exactly. Okay? Of course, we all know what the Quran is, but they want to be very specific about what they mean by it. I don't want to get into those details, okay? We're trying to keep things very concise and simple in these sessions, but at the same time cover as much area as we can and hint at some of the things that are out there. So what we want to talk about is, we know what the Quran is assuming, we know all of that. We want to see, is there anyone out there who believes that we cannot go to the Quran when it comes to learning and deriving Islamic law? And the answer is, for 1,000 years, there wasn't anybody who said that. But after, 1,000 years, around 1,000 years later, after the time of the Imams, all of a sudden a discussion comes up. A discussion comes up by one of the founders, if not the founder, of the Akhbari school of thought. Okay? Now we'll get into the whole history of the Akhbaris later, not for these sessions. Right now we're talking about the Quran and it being a reference for us when it comes to Islamic law. But we'll get to the whole story of Akhbarism, where it came from. And when I say Akhbarism has different grades and types, I would say. And I like to say it like this, that you have an Akhbarism with a capital A, okay, and then you have an Akhbarism which is another term for hadith, okay? Was that? Maybe they were messing with the volumes. I think it's good now, yeah? So don't take it up and down. So, as I said, Akhbarism, you can have it with a capital A, you can have it with a lowercase a. That's how I see it. That's how I like to explain it. With a lowercase a, it means those who give a lot of importance to akhbar. Akhbar meaning ahadith. Okay? So for example, Shaykh al-Saduq will be referred to as an akhbari. Why? Because he compiled hadith books. He gives a lot of importance to ahadith. You'll have someone like Shaykh Hurr al-Amili, the one who compiled Wasa'il al-Shi'a. He's one of the later muhaddithin. he's also referred to as an akhbari. These are all akhbaris in the sense that they gave a lot of importance to akhbar. Majlisi, Allama Majlisi, compiler of Bihar al-Anwar, referred to as an akhbari again. They have their tendencies towards akhbar, aka ahadith, and that pushed them to compile great works in regards to ahadith that we use till today. But then you have the akhbari school of thought, and you have akhbarism with a capital A, let's call it. That kind of started in the 11th century after Hijrah-ish, with a person by the name of Muhammad Amin Astarabadi. Okay, so he's famous for that. And he died in the early 11th century. Put it in here. Sorry about that. So, the first person to come up with this idea of, hey, can we even go to the Quran for deriving Islamic law was this Muhammad Amin Astarabadi, they say. Before it, this discussion was unprecedented. Now, he doesn't necessarily say, oh, we can't go to the Quran, but he has a chapter in his book, which they say there's only one book from him, Al-Fawaid al-Madaniyah, in which he has this chapter, chapter 2, Al-Fasl al-Thani, في بيان انحصار مدرك ما ليس من ضروريات الدين من المسائل الشرعية أصلية كانت أو فرعية في السماع عن الصادقين, which means that the chapter 2, the chapter that talks about the reason for why, if you're going to say anything about the religion that is not one of those widely accepted tenets of the faith, all right? So it's something that you're not sure about 100%. It's not widely accepted. You can only talk about it if you heard it from as-Sadiqain. Who are the as-Sadiqain? Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq alayhim as-salam. These two are the main ones that we get our hadiths from when it comes to our aqa'id and theology, or when it comes to our ahkam and rulings and so on. He says, and so someone might ask, well, what about the other imams? Well, these two are the main ones. Of course, he means the other imams as well. Some might read this as as-Sadiqeen, which is plural, not muthanna, which is dual. As-Sadiqeen meaning all the imams that were truthful. Anyway, it's clear what he means here. That if you hear it from the imams, you can only believe in it. But if you hear it from anywhere else, you can't. And so in that chapter, he brings 9 reasons. We don't want to go through that. This is not a Hawza class that we're in. He goes through 9 reasons, some of which when you read them, you're just like, I don't know what's going on here. For example, he says, we're not 100% sure that we can refer to the Quran. Oh, excuse me, the Quran is telling us to refer to the Prophet, to refer to the Imams. What do you mean? Like, what's going on here? But anyway, he has his reasons, 9 reasons that he goes through, that we cannot go to the Quran. And after he finishes all of that, and as I said, indirectly he's saying you can't go to the Quran. When you say the only place you can learn it from is the Imams, that means you can't go to the Quran. In the end, he concludes, if we cling to the words of the Imams, we will be saved from error. There is no other way to guarantee not falling into error. Only if you go to the Imams. Clearly, protection from error is something preferable, both intellectually and legally. I mean, this is something we all agree on. Yes, it's something good for us to be protected from error. But where are you getting this from? The only way to be protected is to go to the sayings of the Imams. He says, because when you go to the Quran, you're not 100% sure what Allah means. Because you're not 100% sure what Allah means, conjecture. This is dhan. You can't rely on dhan. He says it's preferable intellectually and legally, shar'an. If one concentrates on this reasoning that I am providing you, that look, you don't have 100% certainty when you go to the Quran,
They will acknowledge you can't rely on uncertain reasoning when it comes to God's laws. So go to the Imams, ask them your question, or read their hadiths, and you become 100% sure what is meant by what they're saying. Go by that. That is his conclusion that he draws from the 9 arguments that he presents. Then you have another one, another heavyweight by the name of Sheikh Yusuf al-Bahrani. Our next slide. He takes the discussion a bit further. Now, what he does is he sounds like he's not taking sides in this whole discussion. But then he presents more than 20 hadiths that imply, and he concludes from, that you can't understand the Quran, people. You can only understand the Quran if you go to the Ahlul Bayt. Okay? Now, as nice and beautiful as that might sound for some of us, yeah, we'll have to see if that's really the case or not. Some of us might say, oh, yeah, of course, the Imams are everything. And then we might practically rule out the Holy Quran. I don't know if that's something that anyone really agrees with. Anyway, what does he say? I'm going to share with you one of the hadiths that he brings. This hadith is a famous one, and it's discussed in Hawza circles as well. It says, I'll read the Arabic real quickly. Qala Abu Ja'far. It's a longer hadith. I'm just taking the part that we need. Abu Ja'far, Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, he says to someone by the name of Qatada. Qatada, those of you who know, is a very big and famous Sunni muhaddith and mufassir. Okay? Even in our Shi'i tafsirs like Majma' al-Bayan, you'll see that they're quoting Qatada a lot. And if I'm not mistaken, he lived in the from something around 60 after Hijrah onwards. And so he's living in the time of the Imams. Anyway, Imam al-Baqir is speaking with him and he says, Wayhak ya Qatada, woe unto you. You're giving me the tafsir of this verse. So there was a discussion that's going on between Imam al-Baqir and him. And so the Imam kind of proves him wrong and off. And he says, woe to you, you're in trouble if you did tafsir of the Quran by yourself, just through your own whim. فَقَدْ هَلَكْتَ وَأَهْلَكْتَ. You destroyed yourself and you're destroying the ones who follow you. وَإِن كُنْتَ قَدْ أَخَذْتَهُ مِنَ الرِّجَالِ. But this tafsir, if you didn't get it out of your own pocket, but you got it from some other people, still, فَقَدْ هَلَكْتَ وَأَهْلَكْتَ. You're still destroyed and you're destroying others. Then Imam Baqir, he ends with this. He says, وَيْحَكْ يَا قَتَدَ. Woe unto you. إِنَّمَا, this is the important part, يَعْرِفُ الْقُرْآنَ مَنْ خُوطِبَ بِهِ. I'm telling you what the tafsir of this verse is. In other words, I'm one of the addressees of this Quran. So I understand it. You can't understand it. You know who understands it? The ones who were addressed by this Quran. And that's us Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. So that's one of the stronger hadiths that Sheikh Yusuf Bahrani brings in his book. And it's a book called Ad-Durar al-Najafiyya. Alright. So this Yusuf Bahrani, by the way, he's one of the main guys that was kind of, was the standard bearer of akhbarism in his time, versus one of the standard bearers, or the greatest standard bearer of usulism, of the usuli school, which is the opposite of the akhbari school. His name was Wahid Bahbahani. We'll get to these stories later. Some interesting stuff there. And how these Shi'i scholars, grand Shi'i scholars of these two schools, would go at it with each other, okay? But anyway, that's irrelevant right now. Yusuf Bahrani is also of the akhbari school of thought. But he had very good akhlaq, by the way, I'll say that. He was a very akhlaqi individual from the stories that I've heard. So he brings these hadiths anyway to also push this idea forward, kind of, that look, we can't go to the Quran. The Imams themselves are telling us. I don't know, if it seems like whether he agrees or not with the arguments his predecessor had, Muhammad Amin as-Tarabadi, does he agree with those 9 reasons or not? Unclear. My personal guess is that he doesn't agree with all of them. But he says, look, we have a hadith though. A hadith that are telling us you can't go to the Quran. Now you and I are sitting here, we never thought we'd have such a discussion. Did you ever think we'd have a discussion about whether we can go to the Quran to learn Islamic laws? Like any religion and faith you go to, the first thing that you'll talk about with them is their book, their scripture. But now we're being told through a hadith that we're not supposed to approach the Quran. The Quran is a book you put aside. And what do? You go to the Imams. Okay? To the point that you can't understand the Quran. The Quran is not even addressing you. It's addressing others. the Ahlul Bayt. So these are some of the things the Akhbaris have said. Once again, we don't want to get into too many details. It just gives you an idea of what's going on here. Let's move on now. Next slide. Let's move on to the Usulis. What did they do about all of this? Let me just say that there's a whole fight, okay, between Usulis and Akhbaris in that 11th century onwards, okay? And it culminates in maybe the 12th, 13th century in the books that we have, and in which the Usulis have really addressed this matter head on, the matter of the Akhbaris. They have this approach to the Quran, and they will also have an approach to the Ahadith as well, which is right now irrelevant to our discussion. We're talking about the Quran, but there's a whole fight there as well of how to approach the Ahadith. Now it's interesting that you'll find traces of these ideologies within some people today even. With some people will have some of these Akhbari approaches even today, although they're not from the Akhbari school, technically. But all in all, they sound like that. Anyway, as I said, these arguments, these discussions, they weren't there before Astarabadi, according to the books that I'm teaching off of right now, okay? They weren't there before Astarabadi. And so you won't find it in those previous books, and that's when some big names come later and start addressing these and designating chapters of their works to these discussions, because brothers and sisters, it's a dangerous thing. If you don't take this matter head on, the Usulis are telling us that if I don't take this matter head on, before you know it, the Shia have put aside the Quran completely. And that is a vicious cycle. Okay? You're going to be stuck in a vicious circle. How do you know you're supposed to follow the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt when you put the Quran aside? Okay? It can cause many, many issues. We're already in trouble with the way our approach to the Quran is. Even today, even though we're not Akhbaris, still it seems that we're not putting enough into the Quran and understanding the Quran and benefiting from the Quran, let alone if the Akhbari school had taken over. And by the way, there is a time that the Akhbaris are taking over. But then in flies Wahid al-Bahbahani, and he does whatever he does, and his students and so on, and they stop this movement. But we'll get to that later. I don't want to sound like I'm taking any sides here, although you probably can guess which side I'm on. But we'll get to that, inshallah. Anyway, for now, big names like Wahid Bahbahani himself take this matter head on. Mirza al-Qumi, his student. Mirza al-Qumi, those of you who have been to Qom, have you seen that little graveyard that's outside the haram of Bibi Masuma? It's like a little graveyard, enclosed. And there's two little shrines in there. One of them is this Mirza al-Qumi. He's huge. Let me just say on the side here in parentheses, I don't remember which scholar it was. One of these Arif scholars, he had said once, from what I remember, he said, someone had asked, is Bibi Ma'suma of Qom, sister of Imam Rida, is she going to do shafa'ah for us on the Day of Judgment, us Qummis, or something like that? And the answer that was given was that, look, the people of Qom, they will take the shafa'ah of Mirza Qummi. Bibi Ma'suma does shafa'ah for everybody. So don't bring her down to that status, they had said, okay? Anyway, that's still a big status for a person like Mirza al-Qummi, student of Wahid Bahbahani. Okay, that's also a person who addressed this matter. And then you have these huge giants of fiqh and usul, like Shaykh al-Ansari, his student Akhund Khurasani and his students. And then all the way to Shaheed Sadr, who have addressed this matter because they've identified this as a big problem. Brothers and sisters, this is just me saying it, and it's not a very accurate statement probably, but you have the Shia Sunni split, and then you have Akhbari Usuli split. It's up there, okay? It's something to read up on and actually look into. It's very interesting. All right, anyway. So they said that, look, first of all, the first thing that stands out is, look, this discussion was not there for 1,000 years or so, give or take, okay? Where did all of a sudden come from? The fact that this discussion is new, it wasn't in the past, says a lot about this discussion itself. That's one thing. Other than that, though, they've answered all of these arguments, one. Two, what they've also done, these usuliyun, these usulis, that are the opposite to the akhbaris, what they've done is that they've even gone a step further. And they've even shown us answers to arguments that the akhbaris haven't presented themselves, but they might have sounded like that could have been their argument as well. Sometimes when you want to really refute somebody, what do? You listen to their arguments, right? Argument 1, 2, and 3. You say, okay, these are the answers to argument 1, 2, and 3 that I have. And let me add to that, if you have a fourth argument, which is this, and a fifth argument, which is this, I'm going to refute those as well. So you give them the argument and you refute it as well. You give them the cake and you make them eat it. Okay? They went a step further and they came up with arguments for them and kind of played devil's advocate for them. Yeah? And answered those arguments that they could have had as well. But yeah, some of the arguments are just so, what's the word for it? Weak, I guess? That they haven't even addressed those. Okay? And I'll give you one example. Astarabadi, one of his arguments is this, that he says, and I think it's his second argument. He says, look, Hadith al-Thaqalain. What I get from that is that it's telling me that because these two are together, you cannot understand the Quran without the other one. That is the understanding, he says, that I get from it. Okay? Some of our ulama, they say that haven't even answered this one because this one's just obvious. As a matter of fact, they've used this hadith to prove their argument. Okay? To prove their argument. Or prove their claim that you cannot put the Quran aside, which is obvious, brothers and sisters. What do you get out of Hadith al-Thaqalain? Put the Quran aside or stick to the Quran? Well, it's obvious that the Hadith is saying, I am leaving two things to you, two things for you, cling on to them. And we say, no, we'll put that one aside because we have this one. Okay? No, this is a problem. And so, anyway, the argument is a weak one for them. It's so weak that they don't even address it. And this happens all the time. Even in Tafsir al-Mizãn, you'll find this. When Tabatabai, for example, is going through different tafsirs of a verse, let's say, sometimes him or other books, any book really, any academic Hawzawi book, you'll see, when they're going through the different arguments that they're not in agreement with, sometimes they'll just say, وَهَذَا كَمَا تَرَى, and this is as you see it. In other words, as you can see, this is so weak, we don't need to talk about it. And they go on to the next one. This is like that. So some of these arguments are so weak they haven't addressed it. Some arguments they've brought up themselves and refuted themselves. The Usulis have done that. And finally, the hadiths though, which was interesting to me. When you read Shahid Sadr, he says, I believe these hadiths, if you just look at the message in some of them, not all of them, but some of them, they are saying that you can't go to the Quran. I think he agrees with the one that says, Man khutiba bih, the one who is addressed by the Quran can only understand it. He says, look, this is a sound hadith for that claim. The problem, though, is we have a lot of other issues that don't allow you to use this hadith. Number one, weak sanads. Okay, this is a problem we always have. They are weak hadiths, he says, and others say. Number one. Number two, he says, we look at the ones who have narrated these hadiths. What we find in the chains of the narrators of these hadiths is that they are people who had very esoteric inclinations towards deen. They had a specific esoteric irfani type of approach to religion and understanding religion and interpreting it. These hadiths are coming from them. And by the way, in parentheses, sometimes very good people in the past, and it's been proven, people in the past, sometimes very good people, they wanted they knew what they believe what they believe in must be right, and so they would sometimes use the wrong means, okay, to establish what they believed in. So what would they do sometimes? They would sometimes make a statement and then add a little Imam al-Sadiq to the beginning. Okay? The Prophet said this. Imam al-Sadiq said that. There are some books here, the books today that we have. The whole book, the book's like this thick and it has some deep irfani stuff in there and it is all attributed to Imam al-Sadiq. But then the muhaqqiqeen and researchers have come and said, no, it's not necessarily the case that Imam al-Sadiq said everything. But then who said it? Someone said it, sounded good, corresponded with their beliefs. And so they said, Imam al-Sadiq said this. No, brother, your name is not Imam al-Sadiq, okay? Anyway, so he says, we find in these chains all these names of people, not all these names, but some names of people who had such a take on religion. What we don't find is we don't find the name of Zurara in there. We don't find the name of Muhammad bin Muslim in there. These ones that we all know were the main transmitters of our fiqh hadiths, at least if not more than the fiqh hadiths. They're the ones who were the bridge between us today and the Imams. Between the Shia of after the Imams till the Imams. They were the bridge. They connected the people to the Imams with their hadith books and their usul of hadith, they call them. Usul arba'mi'ah, these ones. These big names, you don't find them in these hadiths. Brothers and sisters, if the Imams don't want us to go to the Quran, trust me, that's a big fiqh matter. If they don't want us to go to to the Quran for our fiqh, that's a big one. And so big names are going to be talking about this. In addition to that, these hadiths that are saying don't go to the Quran, they go against the widespread practice of Muslims forever. And so if that's the case, you're going to need something big to counter it, not just some one little weak hadith somewhere or 5 weak hadith somewhere. That, by the way, I want to say, not all of them are clearly refraining us from going to the Quran. You know, you have to really push some of them to get that out of them. You really have to go out of your way to kind of understand that, oh, this hadith is saying don't go to the Quran. You really have to push to understand that from them. All right, so these kinds of hadiths are going against something that's widespread practice. If the Imams really think about it, the Imams went all out when it came to letting their Shia know they're not supposed to go to Qiyas. Okay? Qiyas is something we all do. Okay? Analogical reasoning is something we all do. And so they wanted to get in the way of that. You have tons of hadiths, a whole culture that they established against Qiyas, to the point that even today, even the Shia, some of them that aren't very educated when it comes to their religion, they have heard the word Qiyas and they know that it's a bad thing. That's a culture that you establish. If the Imams want us to go against the Quran, which is a 500 million times more established culture than going to Qiyas, that's what every Muslim does, they go to Quran to learn from it, then the Imams had to make sure that no one goes to it. They would have to put out a lot of literature. But we don't find that, especially through these big names of the likes of Zurara and Muhammad bin Muslim and these ones. Okay, so we don't have any of that as well. In addition to all of this, and I will end with this, we also have a whole hadith corpus that tells us that, and these are called the hadith of arda. When you do arda of something on something else, you present it to something else, you bounce it off of something else. You know, in Farsi we say arz kardan, right? When you present something to something else or bounce it off of something else, you're doing arda of it. We have a hadith that are referred to as the hadith of arda, where the Imam says, if you're not sure about a hadith, did we say it, did we not, what do? What's the measuring stick? What do you bounce it off of to make sure that it's right or not? They say bounce it off of the Quran. As if that is your main source of information. That is the origin of all knowledge. You bounce other things off of that to see if that's knowledge too or not. To see if the Imam said it or not. Okay? If the Quran was not to be referred to, it would make no sense for the Imams to say that's the main one to go to see if we said something. If something is attributed to us, but it goes against Kitabullah, then we didn't say it. Very simple. And then now here we are saying, no, we can't go to the Quran for understanding. The zahir of the Quran, the apparent meaning of the Quran is not hujjah on us, is not binding on us. Then what did this Quran come for? Okay. Now once again, these are deep discussions. There's a lot of back and forth, and there's a whole development and evolution of these discussions as well. But I think that should be enough for this session and for this class that we have. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Any questions? Yeah? So the question, if some of you didn't hear, he's saying, well, don't we see that the Prophet ﷺ was putting so much effort into the Quran being transcribed, and there's a whole list of names of the scribes of the Prophet recording the Quran as it was revealed and so on. Why would the Prophet do all of that if the Quran is not a book that we're supposed to go to? And someone might argue, although that's what you're saying is also probably one of the answers that are given by the usulis. Someone might say this though, that yes, initially the Quran was to be preserved because the Imams were going to become Khalifa and become the point of reference of everybody for knowledge. And so everyone was going to go to them and they would explain the Quran to everybody. Okay? So, but that didn't happen. And others took Khilafah. And so after that, the Quran is to not be referred to anymore. Now, I will say this, and I forgot to say it in the talk. They don't say put the Quran away completely. They say if you have a hadith for a verse, then you can go to that verse. But if you don't have a hadith for the verse, you can't go for it. You can't understand that verse. So the answer that they might give you is that look, yeah, we're not saying put the Quran aside completely. The Quran is batil, astaghfirullah. No. What we're saying is you can only understand the Quran properly and achieve yaqeen towards any verses of it. What is meant by those verses is if you have a hadith next to it. Now someone might ask, well, those hadiths, who says those are always reliable? That goes back to the approach that the akhbaris have to hadiths and how they're very, very lenient when it comes to accepting hadiths. Okay? And how they look at the 4 main books of hadith and even the ones that came after. Okay? So that's a discussion in of itself. Yes. So what is their approach to hadiths and verifying them? We'll get to that probably in the sunnah part of our discussion. But right now, in a nutshell, what I can tell you is that, yeah, they're very, very flexible to the point where some will even believe that if it's in one of those 4 main books, the Imams have said it for sure. Some will go maybe even further than that and extend that leniency to secondary collections such as Wasa'il al-Shia or Bihar al-Anwar even, and these ones as well. So it's a discussion in of itself. As I said, I don't want to say anything wrong right now. I have to look into it more. But what's for sure is if we don't get to it in the sunnah part of our discussions here, we'll probably get to it in the akhbari versus usuli school discussion later on when we're talking about the different eras of fiqh and ijtihad of the Shi'i school. Okay? We'll get to it there for sure, inshallah. Anything else? Yes? What was their agenda for all of this, the akhbaris? That they really were convinced. They were convinced that you can, and there's a lot of different things out there, and even today, people who are good intentioned, they will still say certain things like that. That they'll say, look, when the ahadith are telling us not to go to the Quran, except for the parts that we're 100% sure about, then that's what we'll do. And we'll have more discussions, by the way. The muhkam and mutashabih. So one of their reasons is, there's muhkam and mutashabih in the Quran. That's why we can't go to it. There are different things that they've said. Some of them believe that, no, there's tahrif in the Quran, alteration. Why? Because we have hadith for it again. And sometimes the Shia school gets called out for that because we have hadith for that. But the Sunni school also has that. They also have hadith that say the Quran was altered. But the scholars don't believe in these. But there are some who believed in that. And even today you'll hear it here and there sometimes. So it's not that they had bad intentions or they had an agenda. Yeah? Unlike the ghulat are a different one. The ghulat there's good reason to believe that they had bad intentions. But the akhbaris not necessarily had bad intentions, but they were seen as a threat and danger to the school of thought, to the Shi'i school of thought. And so, yeah, the scholars really countered them as much as they could. And really, they never became like a mainstream ever. They were close to maybe becoming mainstream for a period of time. But all in all, yeah, they never took over completely such that the usulis had no way to come back. We'll get to the history. From what I remember, there is a period that they were very strong though, especially in the Karbala Hawza. Yeah. Yeah. The akhbarism today versus the akhbarism of Muhammad Amin Astarabadi's time, I would say they have some of the things that the akhbaris today. Now they say there are some of them, if I'm not mistaken, in Bahrain and other places that are still like an akhbari school. Those ones I haven't really looked into, but in where we are living, and when the term the akhbari term comes up, we're talking about certain people, in a community. We say, oh, there's some akhbaris here. What is meant there usually is that some of the things that old school akhbaris believed in, these people also believe in. Like, for example, they'll say any hadith is a correct and reliable hadith. They might not really care too much about the Quran, for example, and then so people will call them akhbaris. But I don't think they're a school of thought out here where we are, other than the ones that we have still back home in some places, like, as I said, from I've heard Bahrain and some other places. Yeah. All right. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Assalamu alayka ya Rasulullah. Assalamu alayka ya Amir al-Mu'mineen. Assalamu alayka ya Fatimatu Zahra, Sayyidat Nisa al-Alameen. Assalamu ala al-Hasani wal-Husayni, Sayyiday Shababi Ahli al-Jannah. Assalamu ala tis'ati al-Ma'sumeen min wuld al-Husayn. السلام عليك يا مولانا يا صاحب الزمان عجل الله تعالى فرجك وسهل الله تعالى مخرجك وظهورك السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته.